Доброго времени суток всем, кто сегодня с нами присутствует на встрече. Меня зовут Ирина, я руководитель факультета в психологии в среде обучения. Мы сегодня продолжаем наш цикл встреч с международными спикерами, экспертами в области психологии. Наш проект называется «Встречи вне границ» от Высшей школы «Среда обучения». И с нами сегодня на площадке будет Джейн Гилхэм, кандидат психологических наук, Университета Пенсильвании. Наша тема лекции сегодня будет сфокусирована на таких проблемах, как депрессия в подростковом возрасте, да, конкретно у девушек и всех, у кого, в принципе, она может случиться в подростковом возрасте. Вот, тема нашей лекции сегодня «Как обезопасить подростка от депрессии». Да, на этот вопрос у нас сегодня ответит Джейн Гилхэм. Передаю ей слово. Большое спасибо. Давайте начнем.
Hi, thank you for that introduction. And I'm gonna, if it's okay, I'm gonna focus a little differently. I'll talk about some of the work on preventing depression. I'm gonna focus a bit more on both on boys and girls. And I also will talk about some of the more recent work that I've been involved in, taking some of the positive psychology concepts and applying them to children. So the larger theme of my talk is going to be on how to build resilience to mental health difficulties and how to build strengths and well-being in teens. And I'm gonna have PowerPoint, which I'll show you in a moment. And just want to encourage you that, you know, I'm hoping to talk for about an hour. I might be a little bit longer. So much that I'd like to share with you, but I absolutely want to allow time for questions and discussion. And if I don't, you know, I'm new to this format. I've taught a lot in Zoom, but to have the live streaming at the same time, if it's possible, if anyone's got clarification questions, I'm happy to take those along the way if somebody can jump in and provide those for me. So I'll get started and just know that there'll be time for question and answer and discussion, and I look forward to talking with you. And also I will be sharing a PDF copy of my PowerPoint so that can go out to the group. So you're very welcome and encouraged to take notes, but know that you'll get a copy of the slides following the talk. So, and if anybody has trouble hearing me, needs me to slow down, anything like that, please, please just let me know. All right, I'm going to start sharing some PowerPoint with you. And okay, hopefully this is working. It looks like it's working on my screen. So again, so great to be here and to join you and to be able to share this work. As Irina said in the introduction, my background is in clinical psychology. A lot of my work is focused on adolescents with depression and how to prevent depression in adolescence. A lot of that work is focused on girls. Girls and women are at twice the risk, although depression is very, very common. I've also done a lot of work. Most of my work is in schools and focused on how can schools help children and adolescents thrive, whether that means preventing depression or whether that means building well-being more broadly. So I'm going to talk about a large amount of my work. Can't talk about all of it, but hopefully to give you a sense of that. I'll go through this very quickly. You'll get a sense that the work that I've been involved in, some of it is very large scale, involves hundreds or thousands of children, teachers, school administrators, research, huge research teams. And a lot of my work has been funded by nonprofits and by government organizations, our National Institute of Mental Health, for example, and our Department of Education. So I just want to acknowledge all of that. I also have had the great fortune to work with many, many students over 25 years, and some of them are up here on my gratitude list, and I just can't possibly thank everybody in one slide. It would be my whole slideshow if I we're thanking everyone who's been involved in this work. So my plan for today is to give some brief background about the rationale for why do we focus on mental health and well-being in schools. I expect that all of you have some background in that, and largely you'll understand the rationale already. So I will be brief on that. I'm going to talk about school programs. That's going to be the heart of my talk. And I will focus on two different types of programs. One is more from prevention, building resilience, trying to prevent mental health difficulties like depression and anxiety. And the other is going to be more from positive psychology, trying to build up positive spirals and more of a positive fabric of everyday life. Along the way, I will talk about the activities, the lessons, how do we do what we do, how do teachers convey these lessons and teach these skills. And I'll talk about some of the research findings. I'm happy to follow up by sending you articles and more details if you want them afterwards. But I hope to touch on a lot of this and hopefully to spark your interest in this work. And then I'll allow some time for questions and discussion. So I mentioned I'll share a PDF file with the PowerPoint after the talk, so you don't have to write everything down. Hopefully you'll have, that'll free you up to listen. So I'd like, when I run workshops with my colleagues for educators and others, we often start by asking people to think about an important lesson they've learned from one of their teachers when you were a child or adolescent. So when you were young, when you were growing up, to think about a teacher who affected you and an important lesson that you learned. I won't take time now to open up a discussion around this because it can take a while, but I think it's a very interesting question and a very important one. When we work with parents and educators, we often ask about what is the purpose of education? What do we want most from our children or our students? So our children as parents, our students if we're teachers. If education is successful, what skills and qualities will our students or our children grow up with and have as adults? So when we think deeply about these questions, inevitably the conversation steers towards ideas about contribution, about happiness and well-being, about having friends, having a close family, about having the skills to achieve our goals, about perseverance, about perspective, about wisdom. And very, very little of it focuses on very specific academic skills, like learning how to add or subtract or multiply, learning basic math skills, or learning other kinds of skills. And so some of the researchers in the United States have talked about this as the other side of the report card. So when we think about a report card, this is maybe, what the students will get halfway through the year or at the end of the year, showing how they've done in a variety of subjects, academic classes. And you can see in the yellow what a report card might look like from a school in America. And the other side of the report card are the other kinds of skills, really social and emotional skills and qualities that we value that are so important that are not usually measured or assessed by a report card. So those are things like close relationships, confidence, resilience, empathy, kindness, meaning, and joy. The Collaborative for Social and Academic and Emotional Learning, CASEL, has done a lot of work on that. And if you're not familiar with their work, I highly recommend it. So in the United States, sometimes, usually it's younger children, elementary or primary school level, sometimes teachers will write more individualized comments like, Johnny plays well with other students, perseveres on homework, and we'll really note those kinds of skills. But as students go on in school to secondary school, those kinds of skills are less noted in the feedback that students get, and yet they are just as important, if not more so. Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States had a lot to say about this, and a lot of his work has been inspirational to me. He argued when he was writing for his college student newspaper, so he was a college student when he wrote this, that teaching intelligence is not enough. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. The complete education gives us not only the power of concentration, but worthy objects upon which to concentrate. So it's that full view of education, really educating people for life. Mental health problems are very common in children and adolescents. I don't know the statistics in your country. And so a lot of the statistics that I'm going to focus on are from the United States. But these are common problems around the world. And if there's time, I'm interested in knowing what your perspective is and whether things are similar or different in your context. So depression, anxiety, substance use, conduct disorder, eating disorders, just some of the examples of mental health problems. And many of these become more and more common, increasingly common, as children move from primary school from ages, say, 5 to 10, to the second decade of life, from ages 11 to 20 and on. My own work is focused a lot on depression, and we know that depression, I don't have a slide to show you this, but we know that depression increases dramatically during adolescence, so that by the end of high school, by the end of students' high school, about 1 in 5 students in the United States will have experienced an episode of clinical depression. And high levels of symptoms that don't quite meet that diagnostic threshold are very, very common. So many more students will have high levels of symptoms. Research indicates that students with high levels of symptoms have some similar difficulties as students with clinical diagnoses. It interferes with social interactions, it interferes, and relationships, it interferes with school as well. So one of the inspirations for a lot of the work that I've been involved in is, if we know that problems like depression increase dramatically in adolescence, is it possible to intervene early in adolescence to help prevent those problems from happening? And so I'll talk some about that work today. We also know that well-being indicators, so this is about mental health problems in general, and I mentioned that they're very common. Beth Dahl, who's a school psychologist 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, wrote about how in a typical school of 1,000 students, so this would be a high school here, you could expect to have, somewhere around 200 with a diagnosable psychiatric disorder. Those numbers are just as high now, if not higher. And there's been a lot of concern about how the COVID pandemic and other stressors have perhaps increased the rates of psychological difficulties in kids. I think we're just starting to learn about what those effects are. We also know that some of the indicators of positive well-being decrease. So mental health difficulties tend to increase as children get older into adolescence. And then some of the positive indicators of well-being decrease. So this is data from a large study in California, in the state of California, in the United States, where they surveyed, I think, about 80,000 students. And what you find is that this is just a graph showing the percentage of students who reported that they experienced caring relationships at school. They felt cared for at school. In 5th grade, so those are students who are about 10 years old, about 61% of students experienced caring relationships at school. And you can see that by 9th grade, and for us, that's the beginning of high school, those students would be about 14 to 15 years of age. It's only about a quarter of students are reporting that they experience caring relationships at school. If we look at meaningful participation at school, it looks worse. It's less than 20%, so less than 1 in 5 all the way through, and it does go down a bit. So we have a lot of indicators that mental health problems increase, and some of the positive indicators of well-being go down. some of that is about the school context and about developmental gains. Young children often feel like they can do anything. They often have an exaggerated sense of their abilities and their skills. But they also tend to focus on what they're learning and getting better and have a sense that they can get better. As children get older, they start to develop sometimes a more realistic and sometimes a more negative view of their abilities. And they start to become much more concerned with comparing how they're doing to others. And that social comparison can create a lot of stress and a lot of negative skills. I think we often have a sense of comparing our internal state, our sense of our own inadequacies or vulnerabilities, and then we see somebody else's external state, how they're looking very polished, and we don't know really what they're struggling with. In our work, we have two different kinds of programs that I'm going to talk about, and increasingly we're trying to integrate this work. So prevention, this is the focus of prevention is to interrupt downward spirals when we're starting to have negative experiences or encountering problems. How do we prevent those from getting worse? And I think about that as building resilience. A lot of research talks about resilience as helping us to deal with adversity, handle difficult situations that come up in our lives. And then promotion, which is building upward spirals. How do we create a positive, a solid fabric in our lives, everyday lives, that helps to create more joy, more meaning, closer relationships? So we're going to talk about both of these. I'm going to start talking about programs that focus a lot on resilience, on that prevention, preventing mental health difficulties by interrupting downward spirals. Okay, excuse me. So resilience, there are many different definitions of resilience out in the literature. Some psychologists talk about it as doing well despite adversity. You'll often hear terms in the States about bouncing back. But at the heart of these descriptions and definitions is the idea of positive adaptation in the face of adversity. So something difficult, could be trauma, it could be more chronic stressors, it could be everyday stressors are happening in our lives, and we're managing to cope with those, to do okay, despite those difficulties. It's not that we're not going to have any difficulty or any problems, or that we're not going to feel sad at all or stressed out, but that we manage to sort of get through and do okay. The American Psychological Association has defined resilience as thoughts, behaviors, and actions that can be learned and developed. And I really like this definition because it emphasizes that resilience can grow and can increase. It's not something that we're born with, that we either have or don't have. It's something that we learn over the course of our lives. And I think that's true lifelong. And a lot of what we do is try to teach school students skills related to resilience. In our own work, we think about resilience with a capital R, that big uppercase resilience, which is how do we cope with major life changes, with trauma, with really big experiences and events in our lives. And then resilience with a lowercase r, that small everyday, how do I adjust when I just have a lot of work to do, or I'm, feeling a little stressed out about stuff at work, but it's kind of more everyday kinds of things rather than a really big event in my life. And research suggests that both kinds of resilience is important. So we know that major life events, the loss of a loved one, the loss of a relationship, the loss of a job, those are big risk factors for depression and for mental health difficulties. But we also know that what are called daily hassles, how we respond to just the everyday ups and downs. I get out the door and I'm trying to get to work on time and my car won't start, or I'm running late for a meeting, or I'm having a bit of a conflict with a colleague at work. Those kinds of things also have a huge impact on our mental health and our well-being. One of the programs that I've been involved in for many years, I helped to develop, is called the Penn Resilience, or sometimes the Penn Resiliency program. And there are different versions of this program. We have a version, the most well-researched and well-implemented program is for school students about ages 11 to 16. We also have a version for young adults, and we've also taught versions for adults of all ages and parents as well. I'm going to focus here on my description, on the program for young adolescents ages 11 to 16. But know that there are different programs with slight variations. The goal of this program, we began developing this program close to 30 years ago now, and the goal of the program was to help students handle challenges and stressors. At the time when we developed the program, it's based on cognitive behavioral therapy for depression, which is a widely used and effective treatment for depression in adults and adolescents. At the time that we were starting out, cognitive behavioral therapy wasn't that widely used with adolescents. It was more of an adult therapy. And we were just getting to the point as psychologists and really researchers were really starting to document and recognize how prevalent depression was in adolescents. So earlier on, there was a lot of speculation that depression was more of an adult disorder, that it didn't affect children or adolescents, and that really isn't true. We know that at least by around age 12, 13 and on, depression becomes quite common, and that it does occur in younger children as well. So our goal with this program was to take some of those cognitive behavioral skills and teach them to children, hopefully before they develop depression, to try to prevent depression from occurring. I mentioned that the focus is on preventing and interrupting downward spirals. This is a school program. We have about 18 to 24 hours of content. It's a group program, and then a lot of practice. How do you, every program that I've been involved in, there's a lot of work on how do you take what you're learning and use it in your life, and then come back and talk about it and brainstorm about how to use it better or more effectively. So the cognitive skills, we teach cognitive skills, and then we teach behavioral or problem solving skills. I'm not going to go in a lot of depth on all of these because that would take several hours, but I'm going to give you hopefully a feel for some of what we do. And if you have a background in cognitive behavioral therapy, this will be very familiar to you, some of these concepts and skills. So we start out by teaching about the link between thoughts and feelings, how what we think or say to ourselves affects how we feel and what we do in the world. We help students to identify thinking styles, patterns of thinking that may be causing problems for them. We identify downward spirals. I'll show you a couple examples of those. And then we're trying to increase students' ability to think more flexibly and think more accurately about problems. A lot of the research on depression in youth documents that a big risk factor, one of the risk factors for depression is a more pessimistic thinking style, a tendency to think that when bad things happen, they're going to last for a long time, they're going to affect a lot of things in our lives, and a tendency towards blaming ourselves, unrealistically blaming ourselves. I think there's a difference there between blaming ourselves unrealistically and taking responsibility. And we want students to take responsibility when problems are their fault and to change what they can control. But a lot of students who are at risk for depression have a really negative view of themselves that's unrealistic. So this is just a model of some of what we teach when we're teaching about thinking styles and identifying the power of our thinking. Our intuitive model of experience, so most students who come into the program and most adults that we've worked with, our intuitive understanding is often that the way we feel and what we do, the consequences of the situation are directly related to what happens to us. So for me, this is an example of something from my life. When I was about 10 years old, I tried out auditioned for a school choir. I didn't get in. And I felt really sad, and I gave up on practicing singing. I stopped singing for a few years. And one of the things that we talk with students about is how, it's very easy to think that it goes from I didn't get into the choir to I stopped singing and I felt sad. But there's a really important middle step here, which is our beliefs, our thoughts, what are the things that I'm saying to myself? And in that situation, it was probably something like, I have a terrible voice. I'm never going to be any good at singing. Why bother trying? It's never going to work out for me. And if I'm telling myself all of those things, then it really makes sense that I'm feeling sad and that I'm feeling low motivation, that I'm giving up on this goal. So the idea here is that if you know what I'm thinking, my behaviors and my emotions make perfect sense. And at the same time, I had other friends who didn't get into the choir, and they didn't have that reaction. They were maybe a bit disappointed, but they went on to keep practicing, to keep singing, to audition the next year. And they had very different thoughts. So their thoughts might have been something like, well, maybe I wasn't good enough this year, or it's really hard to get into the choir at this grade. Next year it will be easier. I want to sing, I'll keep trying. So this just illustrates the power of our thinking and the importance of identifying our beliefs. And lots of times our beliefs may be accurate and aren't causing us problems. But one of the things with depression and anxiety is that there's a tendency to have beliefs that aren't true, that can cause us to behave, to feel bad or worried unnecessarily, and that can cause us to act in ways that are self-defeating. And so we'll talk a bit about that. I'm going to skip that just because I want to make sure that I get to everything. So this is an example of a downward spiral and how our beliefs, our thinking can lead to behaviors that cause problems for us. So here's a common example from middle school. So kids in our program who might be, 12, 13 years old, the negative event in this situation is didn't get invited to a party or a social event. And the teen is thinking, I didn't get invited, my other friends got invited. It must be that nobody likes me. I don't really have any true friends. I'll never have any friends. And if the teen is saying that to himself, you can understand how when he goes into the lunchroom at school the next day, he may be feeling sad. He may decide not to sit at the table with his friends. He may withdraw. And that withdrawing and self-isolating can then lead him to not engage with friends, to not nurture those friendships. And then ultimately, the next time there's a party, maybe he doesn't get invited to that. So it can create a downward spiral. Educators note this with achievement all of the time. I mean, it's very, very common. A student gets a low grade on a test, thinks I'm stupid, I can't do math, and feels sad, feels hopeless, and then stops studying. And then if you're not studying, the next time you have a test, you're going to do poorly and you're going to think, okay, this is more evidence that I can't do this, that I'm stupid. So what we're trying to do in this program is identify the thinking that leads to these downward spirals and interrupt it, to give students some skills for identifying those thoughts and for challenging them. And the way we do this is we use a detective analogy. So we try to teach students to be a detective when it comes to their thinking. When you're thinking something like, I'm stupid, I can't do math, well, what are other ways of thinking about the situation? Maybe I didn't study hard enough. Maybe fractions is just really hard for me and I need to get some extra help. So how else can I think about the situation? And then thinking about evidence. Yeah, I didn't study. Last night was really busy. I didn't get to study. Or, I've done well in the past. It's just this particular part of math that's been really hard for me. So we help students to think more flexibly, more accurately. We help to teach them to do this first slowly, on worksheets, writing things out and really thinking things through. And then we help students to do this on the spot so that it becomes much more habitual, so that they can identify those negative thoughts in the moment, and then they can start to challenge them in the moment. One of the things that we also talk with students about is, what would you tell a friend? Oftentimes we beat ourselves up more, we're harder on ourselves than we would be on somebody else that we cared about. So it's very easy for me to think I'm stupid, I can't do anything right. But if my friend is telling me that, I'm going to marshal a whole lot of evidence. I'm going to talk with her about, no, that's not true. You're just feeling down right now, but look at all of these things that you've done well. But we don't tend to do that for ourselves. So it's really, some of this is about trying to learn how to be a friend or more of a friend to ourselves. We teach many behavioral skills. I'm not going to go into these in depth, but just to give you a little bit of a feel for them. And the literature on coping and problem solving defines, there are very many different definitions of problem solving and coping. In my own thinking, I find it helpful to think about problem solving as things that you can do out there in the world, actions you can take that can help to make a situation better. Assertiveness, learning how to talk to somebody about something they're doing that's upsetting you in a way that's respectful to them, but also takes into account your needs. So it's really respectful for both people. We teach assertiveness skills. We teach negotiation strategies. How do you work together to come to a compromise? How do you recognize what both people want and need? We teach creative problem solving, coming up, generating a long, long list of possible solutions and suspending your judgment, and then going back and thinking more carefully about, okay, well, what do I want to try? What would work best and why? And that's really important for students who are struggling with some symptoms of depression. Oftentimes students who are at risk of depression think about one solution, or they might feel like it's hopeless, there are no solutions. But very commonly, for example, they might get into a fight with a friend, say, okay, I'm going to call my friend and apologize. They call the friend hangs up, and they think, okay, that's it, the relationship's over, there's really nothing I can do. And what we're trying to encourage students to do is say, that's one thing, you tried one solution, let's come back and think about all of the other things that you could try. And coping, I think about is, how do I, when there's really nothing I can do right out there in the world to make the situation better, or maybe there is, but now is not the time, I need to take care of myself. How can I take care of myself? Emotion control. So when I'm feeling really, really stressed or really angry and it's not productive, how can I calm myself down? Taking deep breaths, counting to 10, relaxation strategies. And we also teach distraction strategies, changing the channel. So just as in a television, you would, if you don't like what's on, you might change the channel to something else. And this can be really important for kids who tend to ruminate. So rumination is this tendency to dwell on problems, to kind of to rehearse things over and over and over again without any kind of productive outcome. And it's more common in girls and women than in boys and men. And it's something that we focus a lot on our girls program. We have a version of this just for girls in adolescence. And we talk with them about rumination and identifying that strategy. So very often girls will write in a journal, and journal writing can be very productive, but not if it's just rehashing, I feel so sad over and over again. Or they might call a friend, and do that same kind of rehearsing and rehashing. And research indicates that kind of what's called co-rumination with a friend also can increase risk for depression as well. So we talk with girls about that and help them develop other kinds of strategies. So when I think about the skills in the Penn Resilience program, this is the downward spiral that we're trying to interrupt. Adversity or a negative event or experience leading to pessimistic beliefs and then to maladaptive behaviors. And what we're trying to do with the cognitive skills is challenge those pessimistic beliefs, help students think more realistically and more adaptively. And then with the coping and problem solving, helping to interrupt those maladaptive behaviors. We were fortunate in that 11 years ago, our public radio station did a show on depression prevention in schools, and interviewed several different experts on depression prevention, went to schools and talked with students and teachers. And some of the work that was featured was by Greg Clark and his team. And Greg has done some really amazing work in this. He's developed the coping with depression and coping with stress courses that are among the most effective courses in preventing depression in the world. Alice and Aubrey went to see, and I didn't know she was going to do this, but she went to New York City where there was a school that was implementing the Penn Resilience program, and she sat in on classes, and then she interviewed some students. And I'm going to read to you from an interview that Alice and Aubrey did with a student called Bryce, whose name was Bryce Marcus. And she, in her write-up, that she listed as Aubrey and Mr. Marcus. So just so you know where that's coming from. So Alice and Aubrey says, and then there's, and this is in her interview, and it's also recorded. And then there's Bryce Marcus. He says he's trying to use what he's learned. And Bryce says, it's come in handy here sometimes when I get mad. And Allison says, a few weeks ago, he said he was furious with his sister when he came home from school and found his video game broken on the floor. But before he started a fight, he stopped to find out the facts. Turns out it was an accident. And Bryce says, I went into the bathroom and I looked in the mirror and I was like, trying to calm down. And Allison says, and if he hadn't taken that moment to reflect, and Bryce says, I would have got grounded because I would have been yelling and it would have been a big mess. And so I think for me, that's a perfect example of how he's interrupting this downward spiral. He's upset with his sister. He easily, in the past, he could have easily lashed out and started yelling at her, started a fight, but he calms himself down. And then that changes the whole outcome of that situation. So that downward spiral just sort of dissolves. It's not there anymore. So hopefully I've given you a little bit of a feel for the skills that we teach. I'm going to give you a very brief snapshot of some of the evidence, and I'm happy to send articles as well on this. So there's been research on the Penn Resiliency Program for the past 25 years. The very first study that we did was testing PRP, the Penn Resiliency Program, as an after-school program. We had about 120 students. These are 10 to 12-year-olds. We compared students in the Penn Resiliency Program to students in a matched control group from a very similar school community. This wasn't random assignment, but almost every study of this program afterwards has been randomized controlled design. We measured pessimistic thinking, depressive symptoms, and behavioral problems. And this is what happened with depressive symptoms. So what you're seeing here on the x-axis is just time from before the program all the way out to 24 months or 2 years after the program. And then what's on the y-axis is the percentage of students in each condition. Yellow is the Penn Resiliency Program, blue is the control group. So is the percentage of students who are reporting moderate to high levels of depression. And you can see at the very beginning of the program, it was about 25%, about a quarter in each group. And that's because we actually selected students into this study who had somewhat elevated symptoms of depression, or who were reporting a lot of family conflict, which is another risk factor for depression. And what you can see here is that the Penn Resiliency Program significantly, the rates of moderate to severe depression were significantly lower in the Penn Resiliency Program than in the control group. And that lasted for 2 years after the program ended. We also had similar effects on thinking styles, on optimism. So the program reduced pessimism and improved optimism, and behavior problems we just looked out for about 6 months, and there were significant reductions in behavior problems as well. Since that time, there have been many studies of the Penn Resiliency Program. About 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, Steve Brunwasser and I did a meta-analysis of those programs, and there have been a handful of studies since then. There are more than 20 controlled studies. Most of them are randomized controlled studies. They're in diverse samples, so that this is a program that within the United States has been tested in urban areas and rural areas and suburban areas, in more affluent communities, as well as in poorer communities. And it's been tested around the world in many, many different countries around the world. So in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in India, in Portugal, in China, I'm sure I'm leaving some out. The findings, so we looked at the research, and many studies went out to looked at what happens to students through 12 months, through a year after the program. We didn't find enough studies that look beyond that to include them in our meta-analysis. And so that's just a limit of research in general. Many programs that are evaluated, researchers don't have the funding or the capacity to follow up longer term results. We found significant benefits on hope and optimism, and significant reductions in depressive symptoms. And then there were fewer studies that looked at other kinds of difficulties, but we found studies that showed improvements in anxiety, in behavior problems, and in coping and problem solving. So that's what I wanted to say about the Penn Resilience Program. And what I want to do is transition a little bit to talking about some of the other work that I've been involved in. And if there's time, a little bit about how I integrate these approaches now. So one of the inspirations for
У нас
me
пока
is,
появился
you know,
вопрос.
maybe about,
Можно ли
yes,
задать? Ага, отлично.
absolutely.
А как подростки реагируют на психолога? Откликаются или не хотят идти на контакт? Нет ли у них предубеждения и нежелания, чтобы к ним лезли?
Yeah. So this is really, really important. And I think, so we've done the program in very different ways. When we started out doing the program, it was psychologists going into the schools, or psychologists in training going into the schools and running the program. And what we found was that actually that there really wasn't, you know, or at least very quickly, we were able to sort of get through any stereotypes or resistance to the idea that psychologists are doing a program. And part of that was that we really frame the program as we are teaching skills that we think are that are life skills that we think are helpful for everyone. And so although we started working often with students who are at risk for depression, we've quickly broadened, and this is a program that is often implemented for all students who sign up in a school. And that's been very important, is just normalizing this. Part of the normalization, and we do a lot of work in the very first session about how everybody has problems, how everybody has stressors, how often, you know, we all have this huge range of emotions, and that this is a program that is designed to teach skills that are really helpful for all of us in handling difficulties, and that we all have, we all can learn from each other. So it's not just that the person leading is teaching. I mean, they're teaching, obviously, but that there's a lot that students are going to be invited to share what's helpful for them and the strategies that they use. So it's a very collaborative approach. And we found that we also use small groups. So usually, not always, but usually this is taught in groups of about 10 students. And I think that helps to make students much more comfortable in the small group format. I mentioned that in the beginning that it was psychologists in training coming in, but very quickly we moved to actually teaching teachers and school counselors to lead the groups. And more often than not, it's been school teachers who've been leading the groups. And so that we don't have that kind of, you know, that the groups are run by people who are working in the school, who are maybe known to students. And that can help with that as well. Yeah. So does that, I'm not sure if that answers, but feel free if there are other questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Пока нет, спасибо большое, да, ответили.
Okay, great. Thanks for the question. Okay, so one of the, you know, in the last, I think it was about maybe 10, maybe more, 15 years ago, we started to think more about how could we take some of the concepts of positive psychology and create school-based interventions that taught those concepts. And I started, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a positive psychology curriculum that we developed. And I quickly started to try to put them together. So first I ran some groups with colleagues where we taught the Penn Resiliency Program, and then we transitioned into teaching positive psychology, which I'll talk more about in a moment. And one of the really striking examples for me of the need to do both parts of this work was a girl I'll call Jennifer, not her real name, but a girl who was in the program, and she was about 13 years old. She was a student who had some symptoms of depression. When she started the program, she was feeling sad. She was feeling pretty down on herself. And she also was getting in a lot of fights with her mom at home and with some of her friends, and felt like she had difficulty standing up for herself and expressing her needs. If her friends did something she didn't like, she tended to just not say anything and then get really upset, and sometimes blow up after things built up, sometimes get really angry after things built up. So after the Penn Resiliency program, her symptoms of depression had come down a lot. She felt better about herself. She felt more hopeful, and she also felt like she was able to start using the assertiveness skills and the negotiation strategies. But she felt like she didn't yet have this sense of like joy and passion and zest for life and enthusiasm. So she was still feeling kind of blah, kind of bored with things. And she also felt like, although she was better able to negotiate conflict, she wasn't really having the closeness in her friendships that she really wanted to. And so this really got us thinking a lot about the positive psychology skills. And if you know about positive psychology, Marty Seligman, who was one of my long-standing collaborators, talks about this as moving from 0 to +10. That so much of clinical psychology focuses on how can we get somebody who's struggling, maybe at -10, to neutral, to doing okay. And positive psychology is interested in how do we get to thriving? How do we get beyond okay? And we think about positive psychology as increasing students' ability to experience positive emotions, joy, contentment, awe, to identify and use their strengths, to find meaning and purpose, to develop positive relationships, achieve their goals. I think about this as upward spirals. How do we help to engage in thinking and behavior that increases the positivity in our life? And my friend and colleague Tayyab Rashid talks a lot about both sides, that we need to, when we're planting a garden or gardening, we need to think about removing the weeds, and that's more the resilience skills and the cognitive behavioral therapy skills. But we also need to plant seeds or nothing's going to grow. And so positive psychology for him is more about planting seeds, that both are important. We've developed a high school positive psychology curriculum, and there are adaptations for younger children as well as for adults. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the curriculum. I won't be able to go in a lot of depth, but so I'll skip some slides just in the interest of time and having time for discussion. But I'm going to try to zoom in on some of the aspects of the curriculum that I think are most important. This is a program that's about 25 lessons. It's flexible and modular. We started it with students who were ages 14 to 15, their very first year of secondary school. In the positive emotions unit, and I'm going to go pretty quickly through this, we teach skills and strategies for savoring, for noticing and prolonging positive experiences. We teach students to notice good things that happen, and we do some activities related to gratitude. I will share these slides, but I'll go through them pretty quickly. With savoring, we have a bunch of different activities that students engage in. It could be trying out new foods, listening to music, going for a walk in the woods. For homework, students are encouraged to take an everyday experience and turn it into a savoring activity. We do a blessings journal that is that's become very common now in positive psychology interventions, but each evening reflecting before you go to bed on 3 good things that happened, why they happened, who contributed to them, and doing a journal. And there's been a lot of research on this blessings gratitude journal showing positive benefits on just that exercise alone. The heart of the program, though, is about strengths. We teach students to identify their strengths, to develop action plans, to figure out how to use their strengths, in their lives and to think about their family, the strengths in their family members and their friends. Those are just some examples of activities. When we think about strengths, so strengths are things, are qualities like kindness and curiosity and teamwork and wisdom. And there are different ways to think about strengths. There are programs that teach strengths from the top down. So many character strengths programs in our country have, 7 pillars of strengths or teach 4 core strengths. And so the school or the program has identified we want to teach courage and kindness and teamwork, and that's what we're going to focus on. And so it's really a top-down approach. How do we teach those strengths or cultivate or reinforce those strengths? There are also approaches that are more from the bottom up. How do we help students recognize strengths that are important in their lives that they might own and possess or want to cultivate in their own lives? And we use kind of a blended approach, mostly from bottom up. And so when we start teaching this, and this is just from a large piece of paper that I had on a classroom wall for a discussion in a girls group that I was running, but we think about, we open it up and say, okay, well, what are the qualities, the strengths that you admire in others that you would like to have, that you have, or that you would like to have? And we have a group brainstorm, and the students talk about the strengths that they notice, and we make a list. And this is just a list from a conversation that I had with a group of girls. And you can see that there's a variety of strengths here: generous, caring, but you also see creative, respectful, responsible, inquisitive, persistent, energetic. So there are many different kinds of strengths that students will come up with. We also introduce an approach to character strengths that you may know about. I'm sure some of you do, from Chris Peterson and Marty Seligman's work on character strengths and virtues. And so they and their colleagues came up with 24 strengths of character that are common, really, if not universal, ubiquitous, really valued across the world in different cultures and across time. And so they came up with this work looking at a lot of different things, including looking at philosophical and religious texts, looking at current media, looking at obituaries where people talk about what they really admire about people, and surveying the research as well. So what I love about this approach is that there are many different kinds of strengths, that there are a lot of strengths that come to mind, like kindness and teamwork, but ones that students and teachers and educators might not think about as much. So for example, self-regulation or playfulness and humor. So there are many, many different kinds of strengths. This framework, we teach the students about this framework, and really importantly, we tell them this is a partial list. When Chris and Marty were developing this, Chris Peterson always used to say, this is a work in progress. This is not pretending that it's identified every strength that matters. So we look at what the list is that the students come up with. We look at this list, we talk about the overlap, and we're trying to be very inclusive. And the major point here from positive psychology is that there are many, many different kinds of human strengths, that all of us have strengths, and that our core cluster of strengths sort of makes us who we are. And my core cluster may be a little different from my best friends and from students in the class, but they're all really important strengths. We help students to identify their own strengths through activities like Me at My Best, thinking about a time when they felt like they were at their best. What did they do? What happened? What strengths did you use? The picture here is from an elementary school classroom that was used, that had adapted this lesson, and where the students were asked to write in little flowers about them at their best. And I think what's really exciting for me about this is it's about learning from what went well, looking at what was I like at my best, what can I learn from that? And that's really important. We're often taught to learn from our mistakes, and that can be very important. But I think we get less we're less often prompted to learn from what did we do well. And I think they're both really, really important. And I would say probably for kids who are at risk or struggling with depression, they can often tend to dismiss what went well. They take it for granted. So really shining a light on it can be very helpful. We encourage students to develop strengths action plans. They develop a plan to use a strength. A signature strength is a strength that they've identified as something that they have, that they really own, or to work on something that's not something they feel like is a signature strength that's important to them. And importantly, their plan has to involve doing, not just thinking. And so I'm going to read to you a student's reflection after. So students go out, they try these activities, and then they write a reflection, and students were invited to share them anonymously with the research team. So I'm going to show you a plan from a student. And this student is 14 years old. He decided to work on honesty, and because honesty was a strength he felt like he was struggling with, he really wanted to build it, but didn't feel like it was very strong for him. So he writes, the problem, the little white lies that everyone tells throughout the day. The plan, stop the lies. As the week went on, it got easier and easier to recognize when I was lying, whether it was to get myself out of trouble or to save myself from embarrassment. And I found myself able to stop either mid-lie or before the lie even began. Although it was never the huge lies that got me into trouble, it was the plethora of little lies that got me out of trouble that were the problem. Using an action plan to develop a strength really worked, and I would like to use this approach with strengths in the future. So this is just one example. We also teach students about how to notice and appreciate strengths in others within the group, within the classroom. And that has been really uplifting to see. Sometimes students will feel like their peers are recognizing strengths that they don't even see in themselves. And so if there's time, I'll say a little bit more about that. We do an activity called a family tree of strengths where students, and they can do this about their friendship group if they prefer, or if there's time, they can do both. But they think about and interview people in their family and identify what are the strengths that different family members have, and reflect on which strengths are common in my family, which strengths are unique to different people, how about their own strengths. And that's a very rich discussion and often very uplifting for family members as well. I think, in training as a clinical psychologist in mental health, we often get trained to think about how do problems run through family trees. So where, my grandmother struggled with depression, my mom, how does it run through my family tree, or an addiction? And this encourages us to think about, well, how do strengths run through the family tree as well? And then we target specific strengths. So we do a little bit of that top down, where we're trying to promote gratitude through having students write gratitude letters, or that blessings journal that I mentioned. Some teachers have adapted this. There's an activity that one of the teachers developed called Catch a Kindness. She's teaching young students, 7-year-olds in elementary school, and she has butterflies on her window, paper butterflies, and she encourages students, and she has a pile of them at the front of the class, and the students at any point can take a butterfly and write down something that another student did that was kind. At the end of the day, she has all the butterflies up on her window in a net, and then she sits and has circle time and reads through what are the acts of kindness that students have observed through the day. And it's just a way of highlighting a strength, helping students to pay attention to it. I'm going to give you I'm going to read a gratitude letter, and this is one that a student wrote about. So it's actually not the letter. The student wrote a letter, shared it, and then wrote about that experience. So this is the student's reflection. When I was writing the letter, I was getting kind of nervous about reading it. I thought actually, I'm going to stop here and back up for one moment. So the gratitude letter, what we do is we ask students to write a letter to somebody that they haven't properly thanked. Most students identify a parent or another family member. They write the letter. We encourage them to be specific, and we also encourage them to share the letter, to deliver it in person if that's possible, otherwise over the phone, but to share. And then they write a reflection. And so the reflection is what I'm going to be reading to you. When I was writing the letter, I was getting kind of nervous about reading it. I thought that I might sound cheesy or stupid just reciting all of the things I'm thankful for. I tried to write about all of the things that I've pretty much taken for granted my whole life, and I realized how special and important those things are, and how lucky I am to have such a great nanny. This is about grandma. When I read the letter, at first I felt a little bit silly, but I knew that it would make her really happy and that it wouldn't seem silly at all from her perspective. I could tell that she appreciated what I was saying. I could tell she was kind of surprised at my thoughtfulness. She said, "You have to send me a copy so I can save it and read it when I'm an old woman." I knew that it was really special to her and that she was really touched. She said it made her want to cry. So that's just one example, and the student actually goes on to write that, you know, how powerful it was and that they would like to do this more. And there are many, many other examples. And I think what this example sort of illustrates some common themes that came up across letters, which is this idea of it often feels a little awkward or silly or weird to write a letter, to share with somebody at that level. And yet, once they do that, and once they push past that awkwardness, it's this idea of stretching a bit out of your comfort zone. It's a pretty powerful moment that's really positive for both people, the person expressing gratitude, as well as certainly the person receiving it. So it's a bit about how creating some of these moments of building closeness and relationships and building positivity. We're not going to do letters all the time, but noticing the things that we're grateful for is a really good first step. We also have a unit on meaning and thinking about what makes life feel meaningful. And two major components of that unit are a meaning journal that I'll describe, and then community service projects and service learning projects. Each class is encouraged to work in teams to develop projects that are meaningful for them. That are related to something they can do in the community or something they can do at least in the school. The meaning journal, as a starting point, we had students read excerpts from these books. Life magazine put together books called The Meaning of Life and More Reflections on the Meaning of Life. And these are out of print, but we were able to get used copies. And one of the teachers who helped to develop the program had already developed an exercise based on these books, and we really incorporated that right into the program. So Mark Linkins is the one who developed this, and it's included in our program because it was really powerful and really helpful. So the idea is that these books contain short reflections on the meaning of life, and the publishers of Life magazine went around and asked people, you know, in all walks of life, to, in 250 words or less, what's the meaning of life? And so there are quotes from politicians, from spiritual and religious leaders, from artists, from writers, from sports figures, and also from everyday people. And there's quite a variety of reflections, and we encourage students to read a bunch of them, to think about what are the reflections that resonate with them. They're not all going to hit home. They're not all going to be some reflections they agree with, but what really resonates. And then to begin a back and forth journal. So the student writes, it's a back and forth journal with a parent or an older person in their life. It could be an older sibling. It could be a mentor. Most students did this with their parent, with one of their parents. And they begin a back and forth journal where the student writes, the parent responds, the student writes back, and so forth. And I'm going to read you a little bit of these journals, journal entries from students. So this is one example, and I'm just going to show you what the student wrote in this example. So the student writes, "I learned from reading your last letter." So this is writing back to the parent's written to the student. "I learned from reading your last letter that I can make big impacts by doing little things such as smiling or helping a stranger out with a kind deed. That will be a great help considering I'm planning to make a big difference in the world. The world just doesn't know it yet." So this is one of the nice things about this exercise, and parents reported on this as well, is that it opens up a conversation with parents. You know, our students said, you know, at age 14, 15, the last thing that they would have done spontaneously is sit down with their parent and say, tell me about what makes life meaningful for you. But the journal assignment created that opening for that conversation that was incredibly meaningful for students and for their parents. This is another one, and I'm going to show you a little more about the back and forth. So the student writes, it's relaxing to think that life doesn't have a specific purpose other than to do what you want to do, i.e. there are no standards to live up to. So that one of the reflections in the book must have said, you know, there's no meaning or there's no standard. And then the student writes on, however, at the same time, such an explanation for life is a little unsatisfying. I do desire a more specific purpose for being here, and saying life is meant to be whatever you want it to be doesn't satisfy that craving. And the parent writes back, you write about being uncertain about standards and being concerned that the attitude that life is meant to be whatever you want it to be is empty. I agree. For me, those standards of meaning revolve around how we relate to other people. Has my life brought happiness to others? Certainly, we need to invest in ourselves at times. We cannot continually give to others and sacrifice to our own needs. The important thing is that we try, reflect, find the right balance, and move onward. And then the student writes back, I really like your concept that having a meaningful life circles around helping other people. It's such a simple idea, but I hadn't previously thought about it in these terms. Your idea makes sense. Would you have a meaningful life if you were the only one on the planet? I know I wouldn't. The meaning of life must have at least some connection to being there for other people. This is related to the excerpt from Studs Terkel, that the reason we're here is simply to make a dent. This also relates to the Yakov Smirnoff quotation, we are here to leave more than we found, give more than we receive, and love more than we've been loved. This reminds me of times when I've offered service to others, although I'd got no material in return. I felt really good when I was done. And what's common when students come back to the group and talk about this is that what makes life meaningful for most students is this idea of connection, connecting to other people, connecting to ideas, to something much larger than ourselves. I'm going to show you a little data, and then I will try to wrap up. So I'm going to show you a little bit of data, tell you a little bit about. So we've researched this program, this positive psychology curriculum, with 350 students. These students were randomly assigned to positive psychology or to school as usual, and meaning they didn't get the positive psychology lessons, and they were followed for 2 years after the program ended. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to sort of do a big picture summary of the effects and show you some data slides, but there's a lot more. So through 11th grade, these are the key findings we have, are significant improvements in positive social skills. These are skills like cooperation and empathy, in leadership skills, and a reduction in behavior problems. And so this is what you can see. This is just showing you the social skills. So we use the social skills rating scale, which is a widely used standardized measure of social skills. What we see is that at the very beginning of the program, the positive psychology and control group were the teachers saw similar levels of social skills in both groups. You also see that social skills increase, and that's a developmental trend. It's not surprising that from when students go from 14 to 16, they're becoming more socially skilled, and the teacher reports reflect that. The increase is much larger in the students who had the positive psychology group, and that's a significant benefit of the program. We also found improvements in what I think about as learning and engagement. So we looked at changes in different kinds of character strengths, and we found changes in strengths that were related to learning, strengths like curiosity and love of learning. The teachers did a report on those character strengths. And then also students reported an increase in their enjoyment in school, how much they liked coming to school. I went backwards there, sorry. So these are data from the teacher observation of strength scale. This is the items that look at learning and engagement. So they're strengths related to curiosity, love of learning. And you can see here that there's a significant increase in the positive psychology condition compared to the control condition. And then we also looked at whether the effects on learning and engagement in school translated into effects on grades. And one of the things that I forgot to mention that's really important in this is that the positive psychology curriculum was delivered by language arts teachers. It was embedded into their curriculum. So in the classes that had positive psychology, they took 25 lessons out of language arts and put positive psychology in. And those were compared to classrooms where they just taught language arts with no positive psychology. And what you can see in their language arts grades is that we didn't have an effect on language arts grades in students who were started out in honors classes. So these are students who are very high achieving, and they stayed high achieving whatever condition they were in. What's plotted here is their grades on a 4-point scale, where a 4 is what is an A and a 3 would be a B. And they're already pretty close to the top, and they stay pretty close to the top in both conditions. This is what happens for students who had lower achievement to begin with. And what we see is that there's a significant benefit on language arts grades, and that's at 10th grade and also at 11th grade. So the program increases some aspects of well-being, social skills, engagement in learning, enjoyment of school, and also for students who are not the most highly achieving students to begin with, it's having an effect on their language arts grade, which is where the program is delivered. Just to summarize, the programs, hopefully I've given you a feel for this. And I want to say, I didn't say this in the beginning, but usually I open up my talks by saying, I'm zooming in on 2 examples of programs because I've been involved with them. I know them deeply. I can talk with you about them and field questions about them. But there are many other programs out there. Greg Clark's work on depression prevention. There are many other programs that teach social emotional skills and positive psychology skills at this point. And so I really think about these programs as illustrations, not as, these are the only programs that you should be thinking about. They're just illustrations. But we've learned, and the larger literature demonstrates, that programs that focus on prevention, that focus on positive psychology can have long-term effects on students' well-being. They can produce benefits that are noticeable to students. Students in PRP, students are reporting less depression. But in the positive psychology curriculum, teachers are noticing a difference in students' social skills and engagement in the classroom. They can enhance students' engagement in school as well as students' achievement. And I think that's really important because oftentimes when we're going into a school setting, there's understandably a lot of concern about if we're taking time to focus on well-being, are the students going to get less academically? Are they going to do worse? And what we're seeing is it's synergistic. As we're working with students on their well-being, they're becoming more engaged and achieving better at school. And so that's, I think, a really important finding. As I think about the future, and this is work that I'm currently involved in, we found that programs that promote resilience or strengths are beneficial. And so now my work with my colleagues is focusing on how do we combine these approaches and what are the effects of the combined approach. And so with my colleagues Tayyab Rashid and Afroz Anjum, we've been working on a curriculum called Strengths-Based Resilience that blends all of this. And we've been testing that out in schools and are working on publishing a manual for that. The programs I've talked about are standalone programs, meaning they're short term. They're 12 lessons, 16 lessons, 24 lessons. I think it's really exciting to think about the benefits of a whole school multi-year approach. What happens when we start teaching this to students young, when they're very young, and we teach additional skills and build on those skills as they go through. And there are some schools around the world doing that work, and it's very, very exciting. And so we're going to learn a lot more in the next few years, I think, about the benefits of those whole school approaches. I think that's all I'm going to have time to talk about because I really want to, it's almost quarter after the hour, and I really want to give time for questions. So I will stop there. Thank you so much for inviting me. I hope this has been helpful, and I'm really happy to hear your questions. I'm going to stop my screen share so that maybe you can see me a little better. So I'm happy to talk about any questions that anyone might have.
Отлично, спасибо большое. Есть несколько вопросов, зачитаю. Какие методики используются для выявления депрессии у школьников?
It's a really, really good question. And I think, so there's a clinical answer, there's a research answer, and then there's just a practical everyday answer. And I think, if we're working clinically, if I'm working one-on-one clinically in a clinic setting, I may use a very different set of tools. I may start with, validated questionnaires or structured interviews, but I will also do a lot of unstructured interviewing, thinking about the diagnosis in terms of our diagnostic and statistical manual or the International Classification of Disorders. And that's much more in a clinical setting. When we're in schools, we're usually not the ones diagnosing, but when we're diagnosing, so I'm involved in a project right now where we're doing diagnoses for a mix of purposes, mostly for research purposes, and we're using the KSADS, which is a structured, semi-structured diagnostic interview that asks about different symptoms of depression. And it's designed so that it's very reliable and can be used for research purposes. And so we're using that. And it takes about an hour to administer. So part of my role on that project is training the graduate students and the postdoctoral fellows who are administering that interview. But I'll say this, in real world school settings, we're doing that because we're a research team. We're investigating the effects of the program on depression. And so we really want to have an accurate measure of depression. But what we find in school settings is that aside from the research team, oftentimes the school doesn't have the capacity to do diagnoses on every student. They're going to school psychologist, may do a very preliminary interview, but will probably refer the student out to a counselor or psychologist outside of the school setting to do a diagnosis. And so the way our programs usually function in schools is we will work with students who are interested in participating. Sometimes we set up projects so that it's students who are showing some symptoms of depression, but we never require that they have a diagnosis of depression. And even if we're in a project where we're assessing and measuring diagnosis of depression, we're not requiring that for them to participate. We recognize that if they have some symptoms, this can be really helpful. And if in some schools, we administer programs just broadly to all students. So the positive psychology curriculum has almost always been delivered to all students in a school who want to participate, and increasingly the Penn Resiliency program as well. So we're not always measuring diagnosis. In our own research, it depends on whether we have funding to do that extra layer of work and look at what are the effects on diagnosis, which is pretty time consuming. And so not something that we're always able to do.
Спасибо. Следующий вопрос как раз-таки
Yes, I'm ready for other
можно
questions or follow-up if
подробнее
there's more on that.
почитать. Ага. Так, меня слышно, да? Все хорошо? Мгм. Где подробнее можно почитать о PRP?
Really great question. So there are many academic journal articles, but book chapters. And what I could do as follow-up, if it would be helpful, is I can share some of that, some of the articles and chapters. The articles tend to talk more about the research, and the chapters tend to describe the intervention in much more detail. So I'll share some of those with the PDF for the slides so that you can read more if you're interested in reading more about the program.
Будет отлично. Мы рады всем ссылкам, всем материалам. Студенты тоже очень рады. Спасибо большое. Такой еще вопрос. Где и как часто учителя... Ой, не то, секундочку. Что мы, как родители, можем сделать для своих детей в этом сложном возрасте?
That's a really, really good question. And there's, I think, a lot. And I think it's hard. I think as a parent, it's really hard sometimes to know, especially with adolescents, is, an adolescent is seeming sad. Is it just a phase? Is it something more serious? I think trying to keep the lines of communication really open, trying to convey that we have all different kinds of feelings, that all of that is part of the human experience, and sort of create as much as we can a space where we encourage kids to share with us. That gets harder as kids get into adolescence. There's developmental trend to just not be as, to move away a little bit from parents and to move more towards peers. But I think the research also suggests that teens are also still really looking to their parents for guidance, for closeness. And so it just looks a little different. I think, being vigilant, being aware, I think that there are a lot of signs of depression that parents can pick up on. And, if there's a big change in the teen's mood, if there's a change in activities, that's been a little harder to see with COVID, as people have had to isolate and give up activities. But in regular times, a teen who starts giving up or stops participating in things is sleeping a lot more. And then oftentimes for parents, the front line is going to be checking in with the pediatrician, checking in with the healthcare provider, who will often be able to do a diagnosis or provide referrals. And then sometimes it's also checking in with the school if the school has good school counselors who can do that. So I think it's information, it's watching out for some signs. So those would be sort of my advice, and just trying as much as you can. And it's difficult as your kids go through adolescence, but trying to keep that open channel of communication so they feel like they can come to you if they are feeling bad. But a lot of times we don't have, as adolescents, they don't have that life perspective that we have as adults. We know we have a better sense of, wait, something's wrong here. This isn't how I'm normally feeling. Maybe I need to get help. But adolescents are just often going through this for the first time. It may be the first time that they've felt depressed, whereas an adult may have had a few episodes and really be able to recognize, okay, this is starting to feel like that again. Other questions?
Есть, спасибо. Есть интересный вопрос. Где и как часто учителя обновляют свои навыки преподавания, чтобы смочь зажечь ученика?
Do you mean for these particular programs, or just sort of more broadly?
Я думаю, что имеется в виду именно педагогов на программах.
Okay. Yeah, so if teachers are trained to do these programs, we'll often do, the first time through, we're doing a very intensive training where they're spending a few days before the program starts, learning the program, practicing it. We spend a lot of time helping teachers to use the skills in their own lives first, so that they have a real depth of experience before they try to teach it to students. And then we often provide ongoing supervision the first time that they're going through it. We might meet with groups of teachers every 2 or 3 weeks to talk about what's happening and to brainstorm, and so that they can learn from each other as well. After they've done the program once, it's a much lighter hand. It's, sometimes if we're able, we'll do a booster training where they may be coming back for one day, and we might have a lower level of supervision. And then depending on the project, sometimes we have to fade out at that point, and then they're just running the program on their own. But in the first time through, we do a lot of training, and then if we can, we do some support the second time through as well. And I think when I first heard the question, it made me think about something different, which I think is something that's been on my mind a lot, which is teachers. There's huge potential for teachers to help promote students' mental health and well-being, and many teachers see that as part of their mission. But our teacher training programs, at least at this stage in this country, don't include much work on how do we promote well-being. And so some of what I think is really exciting to me is work where these kinds of social emotional approaches or prevention approaches are getting introduced as teachers are learning how to teach to begin with. And so I think that we're going to see a lot more of that in the future as well.
Спасибо. В программах обучения участвуют только по желанию или дети участвуют классами и могут не проявлять выраженной заинтересованности в участии?
So I haven't seen, I mean, there are a few different ways the program operates. So I'll say that in the projects that I've been involved in, mostly the program's been used for a research context. And then the ethics requirement for the research is that students can't be forced to be in the program. So they have to agree and their parents have to agree for them to be in the program. But there are some schools that have decided to use these programs. And when the programs are used by a school as part of its regular curriculum, they don't have to have consent. So they, that usually what the school will do is say, we're going to offer a well-being program. This is what the program is. This is what it's trying to do. We're going to make this available and plan to offer it to all students. If you don't want to be in it, let us know and we'll figure something else out. So that's often how things run when schools are adopting a program and don't want to, it's not a research project anymore. Schools typically have the right to, with some boundaries, but they typically have the right to do sort of some health education or mental health education without having that parental consent piece, but they have to notify parents about what they're doing. At least in this country, typically they do. But we've seen schools like, so Geelong Grammar School in Australia has used the Penn Resiliency Program and also a version of the Penn Resiliency Program and a version of the positive psychology curriculum. And that's just been part of what they give to all students. And it's very much, these are life skills. This is very normalized. It's not about, I don't even know they're not focused on depression in the way that we may be focused on depression sometimes in our research, but these are skills that are helpful, learning how to recognize your thoughts, learning how to act assertively and speak up when something's bothering you in a way that's respectful, learning how to notice the good things in your life and build on those. They really see as life skills. And so it's part of the focus of their programming, but they also make that very clear when students enroll in the school.
Спасибо. В рамках исследования были ли учтены взаимосвязь привязанности и депрессии? И это на сегодня, наверное, последний вопрос. Вот, спасибо. Конечно. В рамках исследования были ли учтены взаимосвязь привязанности и депрессии?
It's a really great question, and not in the research that I've talked about. There are projects that I've been involved in that are much more relationship focused. And so, for example, I've collaborated a bit. So Guy Diamond, who's in Philadelphia at Drexel University and formerly at Children's Hospital, has developed an attachment-based family therapy for depression for teens who are depressed. And that focuses a lot on that attachment between the adolescent and parents. And I've done some work on that project. It's really great work, and so highly recommend his work. It's called Attachment-Based Family Therapy, and it's been found to be effective for depression and other kinds of difficulties in adolescence. The other project that I've been involved in, so Jamie Young, who's a psychologist also in Philadelphia at Children's Hospital, has, with her colleagues, developed a depression prevention program that focuses on interpersonal skills and relationships. And so I've been collaborating with Jamie and her team to test that program out in schools as well. And it's very relationship focused. It teaches a bunch of skills. There's some overlap with the social skills in PRP, the assertiveness skills, the negotiation skills, but it's much more focused on social skills and relationships. And that program has been found to be effective as well in preventing depression. I think one of the things that excites me as a depression researcher is that there are many different kinds of treatments and prevention programs that seem to be effective. With treatment, we know there's a lot that's been effective. Prevention is a newer area, but we know that cognitive behavioral therapy programs have shown great promise, but interpersonal programs like Jamie Young's are showing great promise as well. So the relationships and the attachment are really important, but not something I've focused on a lot in this work.
Спасибо большое. Спасибо за сегодняшнюю лекцию. В принципе, мы уложились в отведенное нам время. Прекрасные вопросы от слушателей. Нас даже не перебивали во время теоретической части, потому что это действительно очень интересный материал. Это очень актуальная тема на сегодняшний день. Да, и нам с нашей стороны тоже очень важно было получить такой взгляд, да, вас, Джейн, вот, и в целом очень такой полезный материал для всех участников. Вот, большое вам спасибо еще раз. Мы тогда с вами можем здесь прощаться. Если вы, конечно, хотите тоже какое-то слово заключительное сказать, то мы вам тоже даем такую возможность.
Well, thank you all. I really appreciate your interest and attention, and it's been wonderful to be able to share this work with you. I will share more things, you know, the articles and the slides. Yeah, thank you so much for your attention and for being here.
Спасибо. Хорошо.
Thank you.
Хорошо, спасибо большое. Я напоминаю, что у нас
Okay.
проект не завершается. Да, мы продолжаем наш цикл встреч, он еще идет и будет идти еще в сентябре. 31 августа у нас в последний день месяца, в последний день лета пройдет лекция по такой интересной теме, как жесты, да, как они меняют наши мысли и мысли других. Лекцию будет вести у нас Барбара Тверски, это член Ассоциации психологических наук, Общества экспериментальной психологии, фонда Рассела Сейджа и Американской академии наук и искусства. Вот, поэтому не прощаемся с вами, да, увидимся с вами на следующей неделе. Вам хорошего времени суток, да, у всех у нас разный часовой пояс, и, собственно говоря, приятного времяпрепровождения. Спасибо.